A school project becomes the spark that lights up a courtroom when a 10-year-old boy delivers his heartfelt essay to a judge. What happens when the power of innocence and truth confronts systemic bias in the most unexpected way? Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from today, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more inspiring stories that will leave you speechless. Mom, what does justice really mean? Caleb asked, his head tilted as he watched Angela shuffle through a stack of legal papers. She sighed, pinching the bridge of her nose before glancing at her son. Angela Walker was used to tough questions. As a single mother and social worker in Riverview, a small southern town steeped in quiet prejudice, she'd learned to handle complex conversations. But this one came from Caleb, her 10-year-old son, whose wide eyes were filled with curiosity, not cynicism. "Well," Angela began, pausing to organize her thoughts, "justice is about fairness. It's about making sure everyone is treated equally, no matter who they are." Caleb frowned, his small hands playing with the pencil in front of him. "But if that's what it is, why do you always look so tired when you talk about court?" Angela chuckled softly, though her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Because, baby, sometimes the people who are supposed to protect justice don't see it the way they should." The room fell silent, save for the soft hum of the ceiling fan overhead. Angela didn't elaborate, but Caleb had overheard enough snippets of her conversations to know something was wrong. For weeks, she had been working tirelessly on a custody case involving Darren, a black father accused of neglect. Darren's daughter, Lila, was a classmate of Caleb's, though they didn't know each other well. Angela believed Darren was innocent, but Judge Theodore Baker, infamous for his biases, would decide the case. Caleb's interest in the case deepened after that night. He started asking more questions, and Angela, reluctant to burden him, gave him gentle, vague answers. But Caleb wasn't a typical 10-year-old. He was inquisitive, persistent, and observant. At school, when their teacher assigned a project on fairness and justice, Caleb immediately knew he wanted to write about what he'd heard his mom say. He scribbled ideas in his notebook during recess, drawing parallels between his classroom experiences and what he'd learned about the world. Bullies, he reasoned, were like unfair judges, picking favorites and punishing others just because they could, and when teachers didn't step in, it only got worse. "Fairness is when you treat people the same even if you don't like them," Caleb wrote in the introduction to his essay. But sometimes, grown-ups forget that. One evening, Caleb found Angela slumped on the couch, staring blankly at her laptop. Legal briefs and case files were scattered around her, the weight of her work almost tangible. "How's the case going?" Caleb asked, sitting next to her. Angela sighed, closing her laptop. "It's tough, Caleb. The judge doesn't see Darren as a good father. He's a good man, but sometimes people like Judge Baker don't look past their own assumptions." "Well, doesn't he?" Caleb pressed, leaning closer. Angela hesitated. "Because some people grow up believing certain things about others, and it's hard to unlearn those beliefs. It's not right, but it happens." Caleb sat quietly, digesting her words. He thought about Darren, whom he'd only seen once at school, picking up Lila with a big smile and a warm hug. He couldn't understand how anyone could think that man didn't love his daughter. A week before his essay was due, Caleb decided he needed more perspective. Without telling Angela, he biked to the public library after school and began reading about court cases and judges. He didn't understand everything, but one thing became clear: not all judges were fair. Some had been caught making decisions based on race, wealth, or personal grudges. "Why do they get to decide if they're unfair?" Caleb mumbled to himself, furiously scribbling notes. By the time he left the library, his essay had taken a new direction. It wasn't just about fairness anymore. It was about the responsibility people in power had to be fair. Caleb's conclusion was clear. Fairness wasn't just something nice. It was something everyone deserved. On the night before his project was due, Caleb showed Angela his essay. He hadn't planned to. He was nervous about her reaction, but her exhausted face made him want to cheer her up. "Mom, can you read this?" he asked, holding out the paper. "It's for my school project." Angela smiled, taking the paper. As she read, her smile faded, replaced by an expression Caleb couldn't quite place. By the time she finished, tears shimmered in her eyes. "Caleb, this is incredible," she said softly. "You wrote this all by yourself?" He nodded, beaming with pride. "Yeah. Do you think it's good?" "It's more than good," Angela replied, pulling him into a hug. "You're going to make a difference one day, Caleb." The next day, Angela had a court appearance for Darren's case. Caleb begged to come along, using the excuse that he wanted to see where she worked. Angela hesitated, but eventually relented, warning him that courtrooms weren't as exciting as they seemed on TV. As they entered the courthouse, Caleb was struck by the grand, imposing atmosphere. Everything felt big: the walls, the doors, the people. But what caught his attention most was Judge Baker, who sat high above everyone else, his gavel like a weapon of authority. The hearing began, and Caleb listened intently as Angela presented her case. She spoke with confidence, laying out evidence that Darren was a caring and capable father. But Judge Baker's dismissive tone made Caleb's stomach twist. He watched the judge's expressions, noticing how he barely looked at Darren and interrupted Angela frequently. By the time the hearing ended, Caleb was fuming. On their way out, he tugged on Angela's sleeve. "Mom, that wasn't fair. He didn't even listen to you." Angela knelt to his level, placing a hand on his shoulder. "I know, Caleb. But sometimes, all you can do is keep fighting." That night, Caleb made a decision. He would give Judge Baker his essay. He didn't know if it would change anything, but he had to try. The next morning, Caleb carefully folded his essay and placed it in his backpack. At school, he told his teacher about his plan, and, after a moment of hesitation, she agreed to let him leave early to meet his mom at court. When Caleb arrived at the courthouse, Angela was surprised but too busy to question him. He sat quietly in the back, clutching his essay as the hearing resumed. Midway through the session, Judge Baker called for a brief recess. It was now or never. Caleb stood up, his small figure drawing curious glances from the crowd, and approached the bench. "Excuse me, sir," Caleb said, his voice steady despite the nerves racing through him. "I wrote something about fairness, and I think you should read it." The courtroom fell silent. Judge Baker raised an eyebrow, clearly taken aback, but he gestured for the bailiff to take the paper. Angela watched in stunned silence as her son's essay was passed to the judge. She wanted to intervene, to pull Caleb back, but something in his determined eyes stopped her. Judge Baker unfolded the paper, his expression unreadable as he began to read. Caleb held his breath, his hands clenched tightly at his sides. He had no idea what would happen next, but for the first time, he felt like he'd done something truly important. The courtroom was hushed, save for the soft rustling of papers as Judge Baker read Caleb's essay. Angela sat frozen in her seat, her breath caught in her throat. She wasn't sure what shocked her more, the fact that her son had approached the bench or the fact that Judge Baker, infamous for his cold demeanor, had taken the time to read a child's school project. Caleb, standing alone in the center of the courtroom, shifted nervously. The room seemed impossibly large, every gaze fixed on him, yet he stood his ground, a determined glint in his eyes. He hadn't expected the judge to read it immediately, but now that he was, Caleb hoped his words were powerful enough to matter. Judge Baker's face remained impassive as his eyes moved steadily across the page, but as he reached the middle, a subtle shift in his expression betrayed him. His brow furrowed, and his lips tightened. The words on the page were simple, written by a 10-year-old boy, but they carried a weight that was impossible to ignore. "Fairness," Caleb had written, "means treating people the same, even if they look different, talk different, or live different from you. A judge's job is to be fair, not to decide who is good or bad before they even hear the truth." The essay went on to describe a scenario from Caleb's schoolyard, a teacher who always sided with one group of kids, even when they were wrong. Caleb compared this to what he'd seen in court, where a judge's decisions seemed to lean in favor of people who looked like him. By the time Judge Baker reached the essay's conclusion, his face had paled. Caleb had written, "I think being a judge must be really hard, because you have to make decisions about people's lives. But if you don't try to be fair, then maybe you shouldn't be a judge at all." The courtroom waited, breaths held, as Judge Baker folded the paper and set it on his desk. His usually commanding voice sounded unusually quiet as he addressed Caleb. "Son, did you write this yourself?" "Yes, sir," Caleb replied, standing straighter. "It's for my school project." Judge Baker leaned back in his chair, his gaze shifting to Angela, who looked as stunned as everyone else. He cleared his throat and spoke to the courtroom at large. "We'll reconvene in 10 minutes. His gavel struck the block, echoing through the room. As the courtroom emptied, Angela hurried to Caleb's side, kneeling to meet his eyes. "Caleb, what were you thinking?" she whispered, her tone equal parts awe and worry. "I just wanted him to see," Caleb said softly. "He's not being fair, Mom. Someone had to tell him." Angela pulled him into a tight hug. "You're brave, but this is risky. People don't always like being told the truth." "I know," Caleb said, his voice muffled against her shoulder. "But you always tell me to stand up for what's right." Angela blinked back tears, her heart swelling with pride. "I do, don't." When the courtroom reconvened, Judge Baker's demeanor was noticeably different. He sat with his hands clasped, his eyes sweeping across the room. There was no trace of his usual brusqueness. "Before we continue," he began, his voice steady but lacking its typical authority, "I want to address something." He held up Caleb's essay, the folded pages trembling slightly in his grasp. "This has given me much to think about." The courtroom murmured in surprise. Angela's heart raced as she clutched Caleb's hand, unsure where this was going. Judge Baker continued, "It's easy as a judge to believe that we are above reproach, that our decisions are final and unquestionable. But sometimes it takes an unexpected voice to remind us of the weight we carry." He turned his gaze to Darren, the defendant, who sat beside his lawyer, wide-eyed. "I've reviewed the evidence in this case thoroughly, and after reflection, I realize I may have allowed my personal biases to cloud my judgment. That is not justice." Angela's breath caught. Was this really happening? Judge Baker, the man whose reputation for rigidity and bias was practically legendary. "I'm ordering a review of this case," the judge declared. "And until that review is complete, I'm suspending any rulings regarding custody arrangements." The courtroom erupted into whispers. Darren's lawyer clapped him on the back, and Angela felt a wave of relief wash over her. Caleb's words had done what years of advocacy couldn't: pierce the armor of Judge Baker's ego. As the session ended, reporters who had been covering the high-profile case swarmed the courthouse steps, demanding statements. Angela tried to shield Caleb from the chaos, but he couldn't avoid the curious glances and occasional questions hurled his way. "Did you know your essay would make this kind of impact?" one reporter asked, shoving a microphone toward Caleb. "I just wanted to tell the truth," Caleb replied, his voice quiet but firm. Angela stepped in, her protective instincts kicking in. "That's enough questions for now. He's just a kid." They hurried to their car, escaping the growing crowd. As Angela started the engine, she turned to Caleb. "You changed something today," she said. "Not just for Darren, but for a lot of people." Caleb looked out the window, a small smile playing on his lips. "Do you think Judge Baker will be fair from now on?" Angela hesitated. "I don't know, but I think you made him think. And that's the first step." In the days that followed, news of Caleb's essay spread beyond their small town. A local newspaper published a piece titled, "A Child's Words Bring Justice to the Courtroom," and soon larger outlets picked up the story. Caleb became an unwitting symbol of hope, his innocent perspective a stark contrast to the jaded attitudes of the adults around him. But not everyone was supportive. Anonymous letters arrived at Angela's office, some praising Caleb's bravery, others accusing her of exploiting her son for attention. At school, Caleb faced mixed reactions. Some kids admired him, while others teased him for thinking he was smarter than a judge. Caleb brushed off the negativity. "It's like you said, Mom," he told Angela one evening. "Some people don't like the truth, but that doesn't mean we stop telling it." Angela pulled him into a hug, marveling at the strength in her son's small frame. She knew the road ahead would be tough, but Caleb had already proven he could handle it. Meanwhile, Judge Baker wasn't seen in court for several weeks. Rumors swirled about his absence, with some speculating he was taking time to reflect on his career. Others believed he was under pressure from higher authorities after the publicity surrounding Caleb's essay. Then, one afternoon, a letter arrived at the Walker home. It was addressed to Caleb, written on thick stationery embossed with the courthouse's emblem. Caleb opened it carefully, his hands shaking slightly. Inside was a handwritten note. "Dear Caleb, your words opened my eyes to something I hadn't allowed myself to see. I realize now that being fair isn't just about following the law. It's about listening, learning, and challenging our own assumptions. Thank you for reminding me of that. Sincerely, Judge Theodore Baker." Caleb read the letter aloud to Angela, his voice trembling with a mix of pride and disbelief. "Do you think he means it?" he asked. Angela smiled, tears brimming in her eyes. "I think you've already started to change him, Caleb. And maybe now, he'll start changing the world." The days following Judge Baker's letter to Caleb were a whirlwind for the Walker family. Angela couldn't believe how much attention Caleb's essay had drawn. It wasn't just their small town of Riverview buzzing anymore. News outlets across the country were sharing his story. Social media exploded with hashtags like Caleb's essay and Justice Through Innocence. But amidst all the chaos, Caleb remained focused on what mattered most to him: ensuring Darren got a fair chance in court. 2 weeks after the essay had been read aloud, the courthouse was packed again for Darren's case. This time, there was a palpable tension in the air. Everyone was waiting to see if Judge Baker's earlier reflection would lead to real change, or if it was just words on paper. Angela and Caleb sat together in the audience, Darren and his lawyer seated just a few rows ahead. The room was filled with murmurs until the door behind the bench opened and Judge Baker entered. He looked different. His posture wasn't as rigid and his face bore a weight that hadn't been there before. He glanced briefly at Caleb before taking his seat, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. "This court is back in session," Judge Baker announced, his voice steady but subdued. He adjusted his glasses and addressed the room. "Before we proceed, I'd like to make a brief statement." The room fell silent. "Over the last few weeks, I've had time to reflect on my role as a judge. I've been reminded that fairness isn't just about following procedures. It's about ensuring that justice is felt by all who come before this court. And I've realized that I have fallen short of that standard more times than I care to admit." Angela's breath caught. She squeezed Caleb's hand, and he looked up at her with wide eyes. Judge Baker continued, his gaze sweeping across the room. "Today, I will be making my ruling based solely on the evidence presented, free of any biases that may have influenced me in the past. It is my duty to ensure that justice is served, not just in this case, but in every case moving forward." He turned his attention to Darren's lawyer. "You may proceed." The hearing resumed, and this time it felt different. Judge Baker listened intently, asking thoughtful questions and engaging with the evidence in a way he hadn't before. Angela watched as Darren spoke about his love for his daughter, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I've made mistakes," Darren admitted, "but I've done everything I can to be a better father for Lila. She's my world, and all I want is the chance to prove that I can give her the life she deserves." When Darren finished, Judge Baker leaned forward, his expression contemplative. "Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Your sincerity is clear." For the first time in weeks, hope flickered in Angela's chest. Maybe, just maybe, Things were changing. As the hearing concluded, Judge Baker delivered his ruling. After reviewing the evidence and hearing the testimony, I find no grounds to deny Mr. Johnson custody of his daughter. Effective immediately, full custody is reinstated. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom, followed by quiet applause. Darren's lawyer clapped him on the shoulder, and Darren buried his face in his hands, overcome with relief. Angela felt tears sting her eyes. She glanced at Caleb, who was grinning ear to ear. "You did it, Mom," he whispered. "We did it." Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed Darren and his lawyer asking for statements, but Darren walked past them, straight to Angela and Caleb. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Both of you. I don't know where I'd be without you." Angela shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "You don't owe us anything, Darren. You deserved this." Darren knelt to Caleb's level, his eyes glistening. "And you, young man, you reminded all of us what real courage looks like. Don't ever lose that." Caleb beamed, his chest swelling with pride. "I won't." In the weeks that followed, Caleb's life returned to a semblance of normalcy, or as normal as it could be for a 10-year-old whose essay had sparked national conversations. Letters poured in from people all over the country, thanking him for his words. Teachers shared stories of how Caleb's essay had inspired students to think critically about fairness and justice. Even the local mayor invited Caleb to speak at a community event, where he received a standing ovation. Angela couldn't have been prouder, but she also knew this attention came with challenges. Caleb struggled with the pressure of being a symbol of justice, and not everyone in their community was supportive. Some people dismissed him as just a kid, while others accused Angela of using him for publicity. "Why are they so mean, Mom?" Caleb asked one evening after reading a particularly harsh comment online. Angela pulled him close. "Because the truth makes people uncomfortable, Caleb. But that doesn't mean you stop speaking it." Meanwhile, Judge Baker continued to grapple with the fallout from Caleb's essay. His rulings were now under scrutiny, and he faced calls for accountability from activists and legal organizations. But instead of resisting, Baker embraced the challenge. He attended bias training workshops, sought mentorship from fair-minded judges, and even invited Angela to participate in discussions about improving courtroom equity. One evening, Baker called Angela directly. "I want you to know something," he said. "Your son didn't just change me. He's changing this town, and I intend to keep learning from him." Angela hung up the phone, her heart full. For the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of hope, not just for Riverview, but for the future Caleb would inherit. Months later, Darren and Lila visited the Walkers to celebrate her birthday. The kids played in the backyard while the adults chatted over coffee. "You know," Darren said, watching Caleb and Lila laugh together, "it's funny. I used to think the system was too broken to fix, but your son reminded me that even a little light can shine through the cracks." Angela smiled, her gaze drifting to Caleb. "He's got a way of doing that." As the sun set over Riverview, Caleb sat on the porch, a notebook in his lap. Angela joined him, wrapping an arm around his shoulder. "What's you writing?" she asked. "Another essay," Caleb said, grinning. "This one's about courage." Angela kissed the top of his head. "I can't wait to read it." And as the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, Caleb continued to write, his words filled with the hope and determination that had already changed so much. In his small town, and perhaps beyond, the fight for justice was far from over. But Caleb knew one thing for certain: even the smallest voice could make a big difference.